Good evening, everybody. Peace and love. Thank you for tuning in to this week's Vision Board Bible study. Let me say to all of the absolutely amazing Abyssinians out there, especially those who currently reside in the greater Memphis area. I know what is going on in the city today, and I had a hunch that most of us would be logging in virtually because Jelly from Philly is in town. Salute to Jill Scott and all of the Abyssinians that I'm sure are either preparing to attend that wonderful artistic expression of blackness. And it is game 6. No, it's game 5 of the NBA playoffs where the Memphis Grizzlies, salute to them, are going to be squaring off for what might be, we hope not, but what very well might be the last game of the season for the Grizzlies. And so I won't keep us long this evening, but definitely need as many of us as possible to share this, and let's prepare to have as much of a conversation as we can in the comment section. Good evening, Sister Charnette. We are going to continue our conversation that we launched and leaned into last week. It's entitled Stolen Legacy. That's the theme or the major idea that we were lifting up, Stolen Legacy. And we talked about thievery, thuggery, and white theological terrorism. We looked at several different passages in the New Testament that are related to what some have come to understand or note as the quote-unquote thieves on the cross with Jesus. So before we more formally get started and I give some people some time to log on and to lean in and to tag some brothers, sisters, friends, and kin to join us in conversation, I want to also ask if there are any prayer requests out there. I definitely want to encourage the Abyssinians to lift up our dear brother and trustee, Mac Trent, in prayer, who is mourning the loss of his son. Also, our beloved sister mother, Gertrude Carter, who is mourning the loss of her significant other, and all of the other Abyssinians near and far who are managing all manner of misfortune. And to those of us who acknowledge and recognize our elders and ancestors amongst us, please keep Denise and I and our family in your thoughts and prayers, as today is the first birthday without my father-in-law, Denise's father, our beloved Eddie Bud Lloyd. We will lift up Sister Sandra Johnson and her surgery on Friday. And again, thank you for y'all tuning in, and for all of those with particular prayer requests or concerns, even praise reports. Please be so kind as to share those in the comment section, and we'll lift those things up. I give it a few more minutes before we open up in formal prayer and get started. Hey, Sister Jamie. I'll open us with a word of prayer in a minute, and I also want those of us who participated in this conversation and dialogue last week, if you have any immediate reflections or questions that you want to raise that were lifted from last week, or you have just been thinking about over the past several days relative to this conversation on the stolen legacy, the thievery, the Thuggery, and White Theological Terrorism. Sister Jamie said a few more minutes off for her. I'm sure they ain't just for you, dear sister. I'm sure they ain't just for you. It is 6:05. I want to open up with some prayer and go ahead and dive in so that everybody can be clean and clear for the Jill Scott concert or for the Memphis Grizzlies game. Holy God, we thank you for the gift of the day. We thank you for the sincerity and the strength that we find in your Holy Spirit that dwells amongst us and within us and around us and above us in so many different shapes, forms, and fashions. We ask, oh God, that you would dwell richly with us in dialogue and discussion, seeking your divine ways through your divine words so we can live out your divine will for the world. Breathe on us this evening, be in every question and comment and concern and curiosity. Be in and between every verse, every passage, every scripture, and every story. Be with those of us who are in need, those of us who are managing sickness and dis-ease, those of us who are grappling with grief, and those of us who are trying to tackle the complexities of loved ones who transition from this life into life everlasting. Bless our time together tonight, oh God. May it move us closer to the spiritual maturity that you are calling forth in this congregational network of friends and kin. We ask this in the name of that loving, living, liberating black Messiah, Jesus the Christ. All of God's people typed and said together, Ashe and Amen. Y'all pray for Chris Randall. Some folk, hey Danielle, hey Sister Gail. Y'all pray for Chris C.J. Randall. He a new fool and he can't help it. Talking about pray for the Grizzlies. But what's up, everybody? So last week I want to remind us of the scriptural passages that grounded us and should ground and guide. What's up, D? And should ground and guide us in our conversation again today. This is Mark chapter 15, verses 25 through 32. It's Matthew chapter 27, verses 32 through 44. And it is Luke chapter 23, especially Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 43. So Danielle, y'all gonna spend more time commenting on the Grizzlies' chances tonight and the Lakers. All of this in the comments. Boy, this is what it means when you pastor the blackest church in Memphis. Can y'all focus for a second? Okay, so again, these passages. Mark chapter 15. Passages some of y'all probably hadn't even read since last week, okay? And some of y'all probably hadn't even read at all. Mark chapter 15, verses 25 through 32. Matthew chapter 27, verses 32 through 44. And Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 43. Just as an aside, we talked about these passages which offer different renditions and perspectives on an aspect of Jesus's crucifixion. And one of the aspects is the aspects are associated with those other criminals or bandits, malefactors, as we talked about last week, and how they are or who they are. This particular subject matter is stemming from a sight of sound in the scripture that was offered to us by Sister Charnette Stovall, whose mother asked her to pass along a curiosity related to this narrative and the story of this passage about Jesus and these thieves as they have customarily been described and associated. And so we dove into some of the framework of the differences between how the story is told in the Gospel of Mark and how the story is told in the Gospel of Matthew and how the story is told in the Gospel of Luke. We talked about how the Gospel of Luke's narrative is probably the most recognizable for those of us who have spent any time around churches during a liturgical season relative to Resurrection Sunday, because there are these sayings that are attributed to Jesus, the 7 last sayings, and one of the sayings are the saying, well, 2 of the sayings come from the Gospel of Luke, the first 2 as a matter of fact, and we find that in Luke chapter 23, between verses 26 and through 43. There's one portion where it talks about Jesus saying, this is verse 32, I'll just read it. Verse 32 says, 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. Nope, I should go up some more. The section, and maybe it's not even highlighted in this section. Yes, it is somewhere. I'll find it in just a second. That's it. I was right. I should have just kept reading. That's a note to y'all. Sometimes just keep reading, okay? 2 others, this is verse 32 in chapter 23 of Luke. 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the skull, we talked about last week how this is called the place of the skull because there are so many crucifixions that are conducted that there are skulls lying all around. There they crucified Jesus with the criminals, one on his right hand and one on his left. Verse 34. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. That is associated with or identified as the first of the 7 last sayings of Jesus. That's the first. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Or the King James would say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his clothing. Verse 35. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one. Verse 36. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. Verse 38. There was also an inscription over him. This is the King of the Jews. Verse 39 is where we come into what they refer to as the second of the 7 last sayings of Jesus. One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us. Verse 40. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Verse 42. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come in or into your kingdom. Verse 43, Jesus replied, as they would say, his second of 7 last sayings. Truly I tell you, King James would say, Verily, verily, I say unto you, today or this day you will be with me in paradise. So that's the scripture that is primarily grounding our conversation and reflection around thievery, troubling this notion of these being thieves. Thuggery, lifting up how Jesus and his disciples by the political establishment would have been considered thugs. Insurrectionists, as we talked about last week. Criminals, bandits. And white theological terrorism, which terrorizes our theological, philosophical, social, and political imagination, and leads us to believe the narrative of white evangelicalism that paints Jesus out to be much more of a superhero than a social and political reality. Much more some mythical figure that is deployed to take black folks' black soul and dip it in red blood and wash it white as snow, than some revolutionary religious leader who is a radical who is trying to empower and encourage oppressed people to engage in strategies and practices that make God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So we talked about Stolen Legacy last week, the book from George G.M. James, which basically argues that just about every aspect of Greco-Roman culture was stolen from ancient Africa. And I dove into how theology and religion is no different, that a lot of what we get when we are introduced to religion, or when we are introduced to Jesus, or when we are introduced to God, is through the Eurocentric or the European-centered or the white-centered lens. Let me walk us through a little bit of this in ways I didn't last week. So, the religion of Jesus, as we started talking about last week, and not the super spiritual, highly divine, God wrapped in flesh, book of John, the Gospel of John's Jesus, per se. So for those who don't know, the Gospel of John's Jesus is extremely intentional about trying to connect Jesus as the Son of God, the only begotten of God, and God wrapped in flesh. In John chapter 1, there is this wonderful poetic litany and rendition of who Jesus is and where he comes from. Starts off, in the beginning was the Word. That term word, W-O-R-D, is translated in the Greek. Logos, L-O-G-U-S, is where we in English get the term logic or reason. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the logic, the reason. John goes on to say, or the writer John goes on to say, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, which is to say, Jesus was there in the beginning of time. Jesus is the Word made flesh, and now Jesus has moved into or dwelt among us, or as Eugene Peterson's translation says, the Word became flesh and moved into our neighborhood. So the Gospel of John is very intentional on giving Jesus a high divinity. He would say every time something was happening, Jesus knew what they were thinking. Jesus knew what they were about to do. And having known, it's all about this supernatural enlightenment and empowerment that Jesus has. So hear me, Abyssinian family. I am not saying that that is untrue. I am saying that's not the only perspective and rendition of Jesus that is offered to us in the scriptures. That high divinity Jesus of John gets imposed on the perspectives of Jesus and the personality of Jesus and the patterns and the practices of Jesus in other gospel passages. So even though it's John who is the one who says Jesus knows everything and is in control of everything all of the time, when we see Jesus in Luke, we don't see Jesus presented that way, but we've been conditioned by white theological terrorism to impose the divinity of John's gospel on Jesus, even when Jesus shows up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Brother David said perception, and I agree, right? And so that perception is forced upon us. And I'm going to get back to this in a second because I really want to get into how white theological terrorism does, amongst other things. It especially crucifies black theological imagination. How God might be involved and active in the lives of black folks. It kills our imagination. It's like you can't imagine a God or a Jesus or a Holy Spirit that is moving in ways that you didn't learn about in Sunday school when black folks were teaching white theology. What do you mean? This might be a revolutionary religious leader and not just the lamb being slain for the sins of the world. And so a lot of that is, and I wonder if there's anybody out there, David, you can say if this is you too. When you first were introduced to the scriptures, whoever told you to read said start not in Genesis at the beginning of the book. Start not in the Gospel of Matthew, which would be the beginning of the New Testament. I know people who have been encouraged. Start in John. So, Brother David said this is his first Easter speech, John 3:16. That's what most of us know. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth him shall not perish but have eternal or everlasting life. Charnette, did Jesus know he was going to be crucified? John would say yes. Mark would not necessarily say that. I think Mark and Luke especially are arguing that Jesus was engaged in some righteous, religious, radical, and revolutionary behavior that disrupted the Roman Empire and got him crucified. Not that he was like, I'm setting out to die necessarily, but much more like, I'm going to do this because I believe this is God's will for the world. I believe God is operating mightily in me. This is Luke chapter 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me and has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. Most people don't know that's Jesus reading from the scroll of the prophet Isaiah. That's actually what that passage says. But this is Jesus' inaugural or first sermon. This is Luke chapter 4. And I think this is important because you can see some consistencies in how Luke is presenting Jesus all throughout the book. So in Luke chapter 4, Jesus goes into a wilderness experience. He's tempted. He struggles. The angels have to come minister to him. Now, that ain't something that would happen in John. The angels ain't got to come minister to, the person that's in control all the time. And I also bring these differences of presentation up because if all you get is the high divinity Jesus, it's harder to follow him. Because you say, well, that's the one that walked on water. That's the one that fed the 5,000. That's the one that worked all of these miracles. And because we have a limited or non-existent black theological imagination, we say, but I can't do that. So part of what Mark and Luke do is humanize Jesus in ways that make him more relatable. So there's some more tension and struggle. So no, I wouldn't say that Jesus knew, but I would say when he came into the knowledge of the inevitability of the crucifixion, he still was, as Paul would later say, obedient unto death, even death on the cross. He accepted it, as David would say. So I hope that answers your question. So I wanted to bring up these differences of perspective that come from the different gospel writers, but I also wanted to lean a little bit further into, how we are taught to interpret certain texts, even when the interpretation is not consistent with the content of the text itself. So we lean into Genesis chapter 3, and it was leaves blowing over there, David, and I was looking. I knew I seen something moving over there, and so I looked. But yeah, but by the time we get back to this particular passage itself, we started talking about how the notion of thief is just flat out inconsistent with what the content of the text says. The content of the text doesn't say thief. Thief comes up as a trope embedded in white theological terrorism and evangelism that says Jesus, so this is the divinity of John's gospel being imposed upon Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel. So they don't say that they were thieves. They say that they were bandits or criminals, malefactors. We talked about last week how Aubrey Hendricks says something about the evildoer and the terms and the original Greek language, lace taste. And one of the things we dug into last week was this idea of interpreting these scriptures by reclaiming the origins of our narratives. I hope y'all remember that from last week, where we say, consider the original languages and what might the writers be trying to convey to their original audiences. Why are there different narratives with the different details? We talked about that last week. We started talking about how in our own lives we should not be so quick to engage in and commentate on narratives where we don't even know the origins of the story, that we should not participate in erroneous social and political spectacle because people are literally dying while we're sitting up here talking about celebrity gossip like we really know people or we really know the truth behind their manufactured media personalities. And because of what's happening in Memphis and Shelby County right now, I want to also say, and let's stop looking at some of the political spectacle and making it salacious, making it gossipy. Situation happening with the city council, situations happening with the county commission, situations happening with the mayor's race, situations happening with the school board and the superintendent's search. Like this ain't entertaining. This should not be entertaining. And if we know the origins of the stories, and if we know the ultimate impact of how these narratives and storylines develop and take shape, you would understand the importance of being able to accurately interpret what is happening. But we tend to be unable or maybe even unwilling to do it because we like drama. And I think we like drama in part because of how white theological terrorism has influenced us to add drama to the religious spectacle. So that's what's happening with Jesus. Regardless of what the text says, regardless of the origins of it. No, that's the thieves. It doesn't make sense. We talked about it last week. From the social and political standpoint, it just doesn't make sense. We quoted Obi Hendricks, who talked about this term bandit or malefactor and talked about social banditry in Israel. It's in evidence in all of the Gospels. But here, the writer of Luke does not use kleptis, where we would get the word klepto or kleptomaniac. That's the usual word for thief. A number of passages use the term lestes, which can describe a robber but can also mean insurgent or insurrectionist. Lestes, Dr. Hendricks says, does seem to describe a conventional thief or robber in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, but Mark's use of lestes in chapter 15, verse 27 of Mark, to describe the two men who were crucified with Jesus is revealing. For death by crucifixion is reserved by Rome for insurrectionists and rebels. Did we talk last week about Barabbas? I know Dr. Hendricks says in Luke 23, verse 19, it describes Barabbas as a man who had been put in prison for insurrection that had taken place in the city. But I don't think we dug into the notion that Barabbas ends up in Pilate's courthouse. Pontius Pilate. This is the one who brings up Jesus and Barabbas in front of the people and say, which one do y'all want me to set free? Many of us have heard of this story. And we are inclined to believe that Barabbas is the thug. Barabbas, many of us probably don't even know. We just see him as a thug, bandit, crazy guy, right? And if you did read chapter 23, verse 19, and it talks about how he was in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city. In actuality, the context of that is there was a riot, insurrection, and somebody died. And they said Barabbas started the riot, so the blood is on his hands. Well, if Barabbas is brought in front of Pilate's court as an insurgent or insurrectionist, what makes us think Jesus is brought to Pilate's court for a traffic ticket? They are brought up on the same charges. And guess what? The other two bandits that end up being crucified with Jesus are likely brought up on the same charges. But white theological terrorism makes us minimize or diminish or ignore altogether our black theological imagination. You can't even imagine that these must all be insurrectionists or revolutionaries. That's because we will not reclaim the origins of our narratives. We know that they don't tend to kill thieves. We know you don't crucify somebody by tying their hands up. You nail their hands. So all of the iconography, all of the imagery that's trying to reinforce white theological terrorism is erroneous and inaccurate, but is needed to try to justify and carry out the white theological terrorism. So, the least we can do on our quest for spiritual maturity, because in spiritual maturity, your quest is for the truth, not the tradition. And this don't mean tradition is always bad. I've been preaching about this, okay? What it means is, if there's an aspect of the tradition that is ultimately untrue, spiritual maturity says you find a way to honor and appreciate the tradition for what it has been, but also recognize its lack of truth and move the tradition towards what's true. And the truth is, these ain't thieves. And so we should not denigrate or demonize our elders and ancestors who have carried forth that narrative any more than we would demonize or dismiss our elders and our ancestors who have carried forth mythical narratives of folks like Santa Claus. Hey. So we know that there's some aspect of it that has some value and some truth, but it is not ultimately true. Ain't no white man coming down your, I want to say chimney, but most of the neighborhood, most of the black community houses don't even have chimneys. But we hold fast to these things because they have been part of the tradition. But if you reclaim the origins of our narratives, you understand even the notion of Saint Nicholas, a black guy. Okay? A black guy. We have to reclaim the origins of these things. We have to be invested in the truth, and we have to seek out the origins of our stories and narratives. And we know that nobody really knows us well if they don't know our origin stories or our narratives or where we come from or who we come from. It's that dear brother Kazula, y'all heard me preach about this before, in Zora Neale Hurston's book Barracoon, where Barracoon is actually one of the people who was on the last ship of enslaved Africans called the Quatilda that lands in what we now know as like Mobile, Alabama. And there's a whole Netflix special on this actually. And this brother Kazula, it's actually called Africa Town now. But in Zora Neale Hurston's book, she's interviewing Kazula. And she asked her to tell him about himself. And he starts with talking about his mother and father, and I think he's from Nigeria. And she stops him a little ways into his introduction and says, hey, I appreciate what you're telling me about your parents and stuff and back in Africa, but I want to know about you. And he says to her, where is the house where the mouse is the leader? I can't tell you about me without telling you about where I'm from. So for us, we should have enough of a commitment to spiritual maturity and enough of a curiosity insofar as what is true is concerned, whereby we can simply say, hey, let's start at the origin. Let's at least try to start at the beginning. So here's where I want to build into this week. I gave us the points from last week, but I want to try to anchor into this one especially, but maybe even both of them in the next 18 minutes. So the first thing that we were committed to doing is reclaiming the origins of our narratives. But we also need to be committed to recentering the oracles of our knowledge. Here's what this means. To recenter means to move something that was in the center and has been pushed out to the margins back to the center. And don't forget, I'm getting into this notion of white theological terrorism kills the black theological imagination. But at the origin of black folks' relationship with God, black imagination was at the center. White theological terrorism says you can't imagine all of this other stuff. This is the way, and this is the only way. This is the universal way, where Africana spirituality is like God has an unlimited amount of manifestations, which leads human beings to an unlimited amount of interpretation. Some more faithful than others, but you want to try to find the divinity and the truth in all of it. So recenter our oracles, which are these truthful sayings and ways of knowing that come from the elders in our own community, come from the ancestors in our own legacy and history. So recenter the oracles of our knowledge. There are things that black folks know about God to be true. I thank you, God. I should be able to charge off of what I'm about to say. Here's the quotable of the week. There are things that black folks know to be true about God that aren't found in the Bible. There are things that black folks know to be true about God that might even challenge some of what is in the Bible. I once said this before. Just because it's in the Bible does not make it a fact, And just because it's in the Bible does not make it true. And if we go back to the origins, we would understand that people weren't, and I talked about this a little bit last week. Y'all go back and check the last one. At the origins, these narratives were not put together trying to be scientifically true. And if we knew anything about ancient African myths, that doesn't mean they're untrue. It just means they're not concerned ultimately with scientific truth. They're concerned with principle. They're concerned with philosophy. They're concerned with ideology and imagination. So there are things that our people know to be true that sometimes challenge what we have been taught was true in our tradition when they were telling us to to decenter ourselves. So what did black folks say about something like this notion of the thieves or Jesus' crucifixion? What we know about these texts in light of the black experience is that empires, like the Roman Empire or like the American Empire, grounded in and on unjust legal systems, because don't forget what crucifixion is a state-sponsored execution. The reason I could bring up what happened with Pontius Pilate is because that was part of the Roman Empire's legal system. The reason we know that Jewish people or Hebrew people didn't have enough authority to crucify anybody is because we know enough about the social and the political context to understand Roman imperial legal systems. They specialize, these unjust legal systems, specialize in suppressing the voices of their victims. I'm going to say this again. Empires grounded in unjust legal systems specialize in suppressing the voices of their victims. So if black folks have been suppressed by unjust legal systems and empires, we should know to not take whatever the empire says at face value as being truthful, especially as it relates to the voices of the victims. Do these brothers call themselves thieves? No, they do not. And do we know that stories come to us about people who have been victimized by the empire, by the establishment, by the dominant culture, that are inconsistent with what really happened, and is usually used in a way to kind of smooth it over and make the empire seem as if it's a little bit more or a whole lot more benevolent than it really is? We know that when our narratives are filtered through the lens of the empire or the dominant culture, it will seek to redeem the powerful and reject the powerless. So it will always behoove us and benefit us to recenter some of the black ways of knowing, the African ways of knowing, the folk ways of knowing. What did our elders say about this stuff? I really wish y'all can recall, and maybe y'all can. If y'all can do this online, I would love this too. You heard somebody in your family who had never been to nobody's seminary, who probably didn't even spend a lot of time at church, say something like, "Them folk were no thieves," or something like that. But we're like traumatized by white evangelicalism, such that when we hear that, they're like, Junebug don't know what he's talking about. That nigga don't go to church anyway. And it could be that he is in touch and in tune with his elders and ancestors' knowledge base, the oracles of our own knowledge, that somebody told him, nah, that ain't it. And if we can actually recenter our oracles of knowledge, then your imagination becomes so wide that you're like, at the very least, before you just be like, nah, that nigga don't go to church, it's like, what if they ain't thieves? Right? Like, what's wrong with that? What tends to be, what is perceived as wrong about it is If you don't know that you know that you know that you know, then your salvation is in jeopardy. If you don't know that you know that you know that you know, if you ask too many questions, that's because your faith is weak and now you're prone to go to hell. But what if we can recenter our oracles of knowledge? Why elders and ancestors says, no, it's good that you ask God these questions. I ain't going to go, I'm kind of getting somewhat ahead. Well, no, I'm not really getting ahead of myself, am I? This is what our ancestors would do, though. I mean, they were known for this. There's a common story that is told. If y'all have ever heard the name Howard Thurman, Howard Thurman is one of the most well-respected black theologians of all time. Howard Thurman is somebody Dr. King drew a lot of his wisdom and inspiration from. Howard Thurman was known as a mystic. I mean, one of the first, he might have been the first African American with a PhD in religion in the country. Howard Thurman had a grandmother who was born into enslavement, and his grandmother was emancipated with the Emancipation Proclamation. Howard Thurman was finishing up his PhD. Howard Thurman's grandmother would ask him to read scriptures to her as part of her devotion. But she told him, whatever you do, don't read nothing to me from Paul. Now I want you to notice what his grandmother is doing now. That's the question right there. So what's wrong with Paul? I'm gonna tell y'all. She explains it, right? Right? Yeah, I wish I could see this. So the question he asked, why? She said, because when we were enslaved, the slave master would always quote where Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. So I don't want to hear nothing Paul has to say about God. He didn't dismiss her. My grandmama, you don't know, she don't know something. Hey, I'm going to affirm the oracle of knowledge that is coming from this elder who literally lived in the belly of the beast. So I'm saying again, all of us have or should have, and I'm gonna say all of us do have. All of us have these oracles that we could tap into, and we have experienced them in different ways. Maybe through y'all remember Good Times and the whole Black Jesus story, right? Like it was cinematic insofar as this presentation. It was dramatic, right? But peel back the layers. Duh! What was JJ saying? Jesus don't look like that. Jesus looked like Ned the Wino. Oracles of our knowledge. You got to recenter these things. I remember when Aaron Magruder's Black Jesus came out, and everybody was, not everybody, but so many people in the uproar. If y'all never seen this, it's like a sitcom of sorts. So it's this, series, and Aaron Magruder is the brainchild behind the Boondocks series, and he would be displaying all of these wonderful ways that Jesus was just a common person. And people felt like it was blasphemy. No, nigga. Blasphemy is making it seem like there are thieves when all of them are revolutionaries. Let me pause here and take some questions or some comments.
They were thieves, all right, trying to steal their liberation.
Right.
Be free.
Right.
There you go. Good trouble.
Other questions, comments, just tell me what y'all thinking, especially about this recentering the oracles of our knowledge. What are black folks saying about this stuff? And I'm not just talking about the scholar black folks. I'm talking about the elders and the ancestors that were audacious enough, like Howard Thurman's grandmama, to say, nah, something about that ain't right.
My granddaddy, well, they didn't go there far. I guess because she actually lived in slavery. My granddaddy said, ain't no one want to read the Bible that's going to tell me to turn the other cheek and fight. They slapped me in my face.
Listen. Jamie said her granddaddy.
Uh-huh.
Her granddaddy said, ain't nothing in that Bible that's going to tell me to turn the other cheek if a white man slapped me in my face. And before any of us get into the whole but forgiveness and the nonviolent, hey, sit with the oracle of knowledge that come from our people. And I'm just going to dig into that claim just a bit. If anybody is familiar with the social and the political context of these texts, there are conversations that are happening intra-communally, people talking to each other in the community, and then extra-communally. So let's roll back to the Old Testament and the infamous 10 Commandments. How do you have a commandment that says thou shalt not kill, but when David kills Goliath, he is celebrated and becomes king? Did nobody say you violated the 10 Commandments? No, nigga. Because those commandments were supposed to be maintained within the community. It meant don't kill another Hebrew. We trying to build a nation here. And we ain't going to be able to build them if we can't build an army. And we can't build an army if you niggas keep killing each other. So, turn the other cheek means, because I'm glad the way your granddaddy put it. Notice he said, ain't nothing in that Bible that's going to tell me turn the other cheek if a white man slaps me. See, that is a violation that's extra communal. It's saying somebody from outside of your community. And you can't tell me we don't buy into this wholesale, because I was hearing on the news today, we are celebrating that America killed somebody from ISIS. Ain't nobody say turn the other cheek. When Obama marched, y'all's favorite president, my favorite president, before y'all think I'm just playing. My favorite president, right? And I don't mean I sign off on everything he did. Marched up to that podium on national television behind the seal of the presidency and bragged about killing Osama bin Laden. Didn't nobody say, hey, we are a nonviolent country and we're supposed to turn the other cheek? No. We know that there are rules of engagement for domestic issues, and there are different rules of engagement for international issues. So again, our elders and ancestors have oracles of knowledge that we need to recenter, especially when they come to these scriptures. They'll tell you, no, something ain't right about this. And we need to sit with it. And we should not ever allow anybody's version of sacred text to justify our oppression. Y'all type teacher official. We have to recenter, not re-enter, Chris Randall, crazy boy. See, you talk all that noise, now your spell check is messing you up. See. That's because God don't like nasty. See, that ain't in the Bible, but we know that's an oracle of knowledge that come from God. Don't like nasty, God don't like ugly, and ain't too fond of pretty either. Them are our oracles, man. Cleanliness is next to godliness. That ain't in the scriptures, but it got some truth to it. You know you can't be nasty as hell and then start talking about how godly you are. Something in that milk ain't clean.
That's my favorite saying, something in the milk ain't clean.
Let me give y'all some oracles from a black scholar, one of the forerunners and founders of black liberation theology. Here's what James Cone says about this passage in Luke chapter 23. Some believe it's from this book, his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I just want to say as an aside, Abyssinian had a whole bunch of these books that we gave away to some of our members several years ago. Reverend Frank, I think you got one. You got one, Reverend Frank. I think Reverend Darrell got one too. Or some of our, I know some of our church leaders got the book Crossing Lynching Tree. So Cone writes that the story of the two bandits, notice how he says bandits, not thieves, crucified with Jesus in Luke chapter 23, verses 32 through 43, illustrates the dilemma of the oppressed who must choose either to accept the conditions of their oppression in resigned conformity or to find a way to fight for freedom. He says one bandit accepts the cross as the final end, taunting Jesus to save himself as a sign of his own superiority, but the other bandit appeals to Jesus as a source of his redemption, and Jesus offers to him the promise of paradise. That will be in verses 41 through 43. Cone says, y'all see Frank try to get his joke back in, talking about brown shirt looking at. Cone says, this story has inspired oppressed people everywhere to look to Jesus as the source of their redemption and to challenge every form of domination in his name. That's what one of our oracles say. Okay? That's a black elder and ancestor.
I'm mad at that. Because like everything my granddaddy said and my grandma we say, don't y'all listen to that old man. Don't y'all pay attention to that old man. It's like he's making perfectly good sense right about now. And she would march herself right on down the St. Matthew Missionary Baptist Church. They come right on back and everything. My granddaddy said, here we go stop going down there and fool you.
So Jamie, for those who may not be able to hear, is talking about the exchanges that used to happen between her grandparents. Her grandmother, who seemed to be a very devout, regular, church-going Christian, probably, like most of our elders and ancestors, impacted by or maybe even indoctrinated by white evangelicalism. Then her grandfather, who was much more folk-oriented, a lot more probably irreverent, inconsistent in some of his commitments to the faith communities and their conversations back and forth, right? And I want us to find value in both of them, but I think at its best, who we are and how we are is we're devout in terms of our commitment to participating in the rituals and the practices of our spiritual community, our faith community. So I'm talking to the Abyssinians. It's hard to say you're an Abyssinian and you don't hardly come to church. It's hard to say that you're an Abyssinian and you know right now we're in the midst of the strategic plan where we're focusing on our spiritual maturity. And you know we've been saying every week that spiritual maturity means not just skimming by some of the scriptures, but actually studying them, being committed to attending Vision Board Bible study. Or now look, I'll be honest. If folks said they were really doing their own thing on their own and trying to find a way to weave that together with what we're doing as a faith community, I'd be down with that. But can y'all be honest? Niggas ain't really doing nothing on their own like that. Nothing consistent. Because we are a communal people. So, if we are at our best, we are committed to those rituals and those practices and those habits and that level of devotion. We are devout in that regard. But we're also open-minded to, and this is, help me God, thank you. This is what innovation is all about in this moment as we're talking about tradition, technology, and black theology. It is a commitment to some of the things that are just staples. Yes, weekly worship, reading of scripture, fellowship, sacrifice. And then it's also being open to the innovative ways God shows up that may or may not. Go ahead, you want to check on that? Are you straight? Yeah, go ahead, guys. I seen it bugging. Yeah, it did sound close, but I've been around. Look, some people can ride up and down Mill Branch, and it sounds like they are literally in the sanctuary, okay? So the innovative aspect of how God chooses to, and so I think it's like the fusion between your grandfather's hermeneutic of skepticism, of suspicion, as they would call it, or maybe even skepticism. I don't know if that's the truth, right? Which is what I'm trying to. what I am encouraging in us, it should be that level of suspicion, because you should be concerned about what's true. But it should also be that level of stability and consistency, where you're willing to engage in the dialogue and the discussion and the discovery of what God is saying now in a communal group. But I just want us to be able to acknowledge and recognize and recenter the oracles of our own knowledge. Like, we got people. Our people know something about God. And there are ways to draw out what some of our people may be saying that has been filtered into these scriptures and is not always at the forefront. It's not always foregrounded. And you know, I'm going to wait to talk about that next week when I start talking about redeeming the audacity of our divine negotiations. Because the way that we've been taught to look at these two brothers, and Cone is doing this even in his rendition. He says in one space, one can find it, and he's talking about the reality of the gospel. In the story of the two bandits, one challenging Jesus's messianic identity with the same words used by the Pharisees and the priests when they say, you saved other folks, save yourself. And the other confessing, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replied to the one who confessed, today you will be with me in paradise. And so on the one hand, it's even Cone kind of setting them up as two different kind of brothers. I think in some instances people would say, so that one brother, he just, and I want y'all to hear this, I'm forecasting where I'm going next week. That one brother talking that noise to Jesus, he just too militant. The other one is a lot more passive. Jesus, you right. Look out, bruh.
Kiss your ass.
Hey, cuz, when you get in that jump, man. Hey, I'm sorry, bro. I ain't, you know.
Don't forget about me.
Hey, bro, hook me up.
You know I was there.
You know I was down, right? And so we'll dig more deeply into that. But my primary point here this week is we don't have to take white folks' word for it. And if you trace back the origins of some of these claims of what we make about Jesus, what we make about God, how we interpret the scriptures, if you trace them back to their origins, they come from the mouths of white folks. They come from the interpretations. I'll leave y'all with this. And I'll conclude my commentary for the week with this. We can have some more conversation. If y'all get any questions, please put them in the comment section. You know, I see y'all comments, and I appreciate all of the comments. And I'll do my best to try to address any other questions there. I want y'all to think about the trajectory of Christianity. So Christianity starts off as a radical, revolutionary religious tradition that gets Jesus executed by the Roman Empire. So how does Rome feel about Christianity? They ain't with it. You obviously can't like it. They killed the man. Crucifixion means if you do what this Negro did, the same thing happened to him is what's going to happen to you. Now, we could, if somebody offers up, some of these other texts as sight, signs, and scriptures, when you start looking at how the disciples start acting after Jesus gets crucified, that's why they're hiding in the upper room. Yeah, they like, no, well, whether they scary or whether they being strategic, and I'm sure it's probably a bit of both, because sometimes you got what Ice Cube dad say. Now John Witherspoon, another oracle now, elder and ancestor. Yeah, you live to fight another day. Look, my biological father ain't taught me much, but one of the things I heard him say that has stuck with me is a good run is better than a bad stand. And so, but my point is that you can look at some of these passages and see that the Roman Empire ain't feeling Christianity, and that makes the whole resurrection even that much more socially and politically powerful, because it's like God saying, to hell with the Roman Empire. They don't got the last word, I do. And if you down for the cause the way I call you to be down for the cause, you ain't even got to worry about them killing you. I got your back, right? But at some point, Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire. This is why right now, Roman Catholicism, Catholic means universal. The Catholic Church is in Rome. So how does that happen?
We've been taught never ask questions like that because it's like some basic common sense shit. But I mean, you never just take time and say, okay.
David, get your wife. You see her talking about the upper room? She tired, boss. Yeah. She's tired, boss. So, well, look, but I'm saying that to say you can see, and this is well before there's 66 books called the Bible, right? The Bible gets organized in its current form at a council full of white Roman bishops. It's filtered. So you got this black revolutionary religion that ultimately, now there's two theories. One theory is the Emperor Constantine, a Roman emperor, has a dream. And in the dream, he sees a symbol. The symbol is two Greek letters, chi, which looks like an X, and rho, which is like, have your wife shit. It's like a rho is like a it's like a P. So chi rho, which would be the first two letters of the word Christ or Christos. And the first theory is that Constantine has this dream, and they are getting ready to go into battle. And in the dream, the message that comes to him is, by this sign you will conquer. And so he has the Roman soldiers put Cairo on their soldier gear, and they go win a war that they thought that they weren't going to win. And so he says, this is the message from God that Christianity is the way. That's one theory. The other theory is there's a bunch of revolutionary activity, and some niggas came to his door with that thing, with them swords. And he said, oh, I believe. Oh, I believe, right? But either way, what I'm trying to get us to see about how our oracles and knowledge have been decentered, I'm trying to get us to see how in the concrete history of the faith, by the time we get most of what we have, it's been filtered through a Roman imperial, or by the time you get to Shakespearean language and an American imperial imprint. And so it's hard sometimes to pull out, even though it is ultimately writings about black folks by black folks, it's filtered through, a white lens, and that makes it more difficult.
I don't know who wrote it, but they did say whoever controls the narrative controls the power.
Whoever controls the narrative controls the power.
At the end, when everybody realized it was the Bible that he had, it was real, and like the dude said, that one was so bad. Whoever controls this book controls the masses.
Yeah. So David brought up the book of Eli and the scene at the end, and when they found out that it's the Bible, and when they found out like Eli's been blind all this time.
Blind the whole time.
Reading in Braille, right? And it's whoever controls the book controls the narrative, or whoever controls the narrative controls the story, and whoever controls the story controls the people. Which leads me to say, hey, don't some of y'all got some stories y'all need to be sharing? I mean, at some point, this stuff is just going to have to click, because these things are kind of interconnected in some ways that I think are valuable. Brothers, sisters, friends, and kin, it is 7:05, and I know y'all got Grizzlies games to watch, and Jill Scott concert to attend, and all of that. I want to thank y'all for a wonderful conversation again today. I won't hold y'all any longer. I'm going to stay and chit-chat with those who are in the sanctuary. That's just one of the perks of being in the sanctuary. And I'll see the rest of y'all on the stream this Sunday. Have a good evening. So yeah,